Okay, so we've taken a look at the predetermined overhead rate for a manufacturer, and what we were looking at when we looked at our previous example where we had a company and we estimated manufacturing overhead, and the overhead was for the entire factory or for the entire plant. And we said, okay, we were going to estimate this much cost for manufacturing overhead, and then we're going to divide that estimate by our cost driver estimated figure, which was direct labor cost in our example. And we're going to come up with an overhead rate. And that was for the entire company, right? And so then we applied that overhead throughout the year at a rate of 50% of direct labor cost. And then after that we reconciled the difference to cost of goods sold. So that's fine and that's dandy. But we also have to acknowledge that oftentimes different departments in a factory setting will have different different cost drivers. So let's just say we had Department A, and in Department A is heavily automated. You know, we might have a cost driver. We might base overhead for that department on machine hours, and then it moves on to Department B, and there's a ton of labor being involved in Department B. So if we were to use the same overhead rate based on, say, direct labor hours or direct labor cost, or the same rate for, say, machine hours, those kinds of things, we could end up with some pretty wide variances at the end of the year. And we generally want to try to avoid that, right? So we have to consider the use of departmental overhead rates. In other words, we're gonna basically calculate a predetermined overhead rate not once, but for each department in the company. And our examples, if that sounds kind of scary to you, our examples are going to be, pretty easy. Probably, I believe most of them are going to be 2 departments, something like that. So nothing too difficult. So we're really determining the departmental overhead rate the exact same way that we are the plant-wide rate, except that what we're doing is we're saying for departmental overhead rate, which is a predetermined rate for that department, is that we're looking at the estimated overhead for an individual department, Department A, Department B. And then we are using a cost driver estimated at the beginning of the year. So we're dividing by estimated departmental activity level. So there is a difference there, but the idea behind it is that instead of is the same. It's just that instead of using estimated overhead for the entire year for the entire company, we're taking estimated overhead for the entire year, but only for an individual department. Okay, and we'll see an example of that, and there's some information down here that as to why we would do this. The first thing is it kind of reassures you that we're basically using the exact same process, but we do this to be more precise. And so, if we have different departments, I want to say this: if we have different departments, and even if we have 10 different departments, and let's just say that direct labor hours is the primary cost driver in all 10 of those departments, we don't have to do this. We can just use one overhead rate for the entire company. But if we have a different cost driver per department in the manufacturing process, I gave you the example of machine hours versus direct labor hours. There's a reason why I gave you that example. Again, we could end up with some large variances at the end of the year. So we've got an example here that is a really nice example. And let's see what it says here. It says how to calculate the predetermined, so that word's the same, right? Department overhead rates and apply overhead to production. So we're doing the exact same thing as before. We're just doing it on a departmental level. So it looks like we have a different company here, and it says the same thing. At the beginning of the year, Sorrell Company estimated the following. Now we have here two different departments, however, and let's see here. Looks like we've got the machining department and the assembly department. Now, if these two companies had the same driver, we would just say, okay, we're going to estimate our total overhead as 600,000, and then we're going to pick either direct labor hours or machine hours or direct labor cost, and that's all we're going to do. But if we look at this example here, we see a couple of things. The fact that these numbers here are different for the machining department and the assembly department, that really doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. But what does matter is right here, these four boxes, okay? And we're going to, when we look here, when we look at the assembly department, there are no machine hours in assembly. So it stands to reason we're going to have to use direct labor hours. We just have to. There's nothing else there to use. Okay? We could use direct labor cost, but that's not one of our choices. So we're going to go with direct labor hours. But then let's go back over here to the machining department, because we do have both direct labor hours and machine hours. Now, for our purposes, we are going to focus on the fact that machine hours are 200,000 and direct labor hours are less. And that's the only thing we're going to consider. And so with that information, we would say that for the machining department, we need to be using machine hours as our cost driver, but for the assembly department, we need to be using direct labor hours. Okay? So this company does use departmental overhead rates. Machining department is going to be based on machine hours, and in assembly, it's going to be based on direct labor hours. We looked at the reason why. So this 600,000, all these figures here, everything you see here is for the entire year. However, actual data for the month of June follows. Okay? We don't really need, in the application process, we don't really need actual overhead that was incurred, because we're going to reconcile this at the end of the year. But we can still look at it on a month-to-month basis and see if any changes need to be made. So, they want us to do three things. They say they want us to calculate the predetermined overhead rates for machining and assembly departments. And we actually are going to have to go back to the other slide to do this. So what we would say here, and you should probably write this down on a piece of paper, what we would say here is that we're going to take the estimated overhead for machining of $240,000 and we're going to divide by machine hours of 200,000. And that is going to give us a predetermined departmental overhead rate in the machining department of $1.20 per machine hour. Again, you should be taking notes right now. Okay? Over here in assembly, we've got $360,000 estimated overhead for the year, divided by $240,000, 240,000 direct labor hours. And so we would say that our predetermined departmental rate for the assembly department is $1.50 per direct labor hour. Okay? So, going back to the other slide then, Calculate the predetermined overhead rates for machining. We already did it. It was $1.20. And assembly, we already did that too, $1.50. Calculate the overhead applied to production in each department for the month of June. Well, we've got 17,000 hours here in the machining department, and we're going to take those 17,000 hours times the $1.20 per machine hour rate that we calculated, and we're going to come up with $20,400. So what is this? The $20,400 is the amount of overhead applied for the month of June in the machining department. Okay? We have 20,000 direct labor hours in assembly. And we're going to multiply that by our direct labor rate of $1.50. If we do that, we come up with $30,000 of applied overhead in the assembly department for the month of June. Okay? And then by how much has each department's overhead been over-applied or under-applied? Well, let's see. Hopefully I can remember these numbers. We had 22.5 actual overhead in the machining department. Actually, I think we're just going to go to the next slide and look at this so we don't have to remember all this. Yeah, so here's the calculations that I did on the previous slide that we did together, actually. Okay, and so we came up with that for number one. Then we applied the overhead here. $1.20 times 17,000 is $20,400. Assembly $1.50 times 20,000 is 30,000. Yeah, okay. And here is our variance. Actual overhead, if you recall, from the machining department was 22,500. We applied 20,400 with our formula, and so we have underapplied overhead of $2,100. In the assembly department, actual overhead was $30,750. We applied overhead of $30,000, so we have underapplied overhead of $750. Now, the fact that we have this underapplied overhead, we don't have to do anything with this necessarily. We could do this, and we could probably get away with taking this underapplied overhead and just adding it to cost of goods sold. That would probably work. But we don't have to do that right now. If we wanted to, we could wait until the end of the year, and it just kind of depends on what we think is going to happen. There may be some reasons why for the month of June we had underapplied overhead, but we know as company management perhaps that, hey, you know what, in say August and September it's going to be flipped, and for the year it's going to come out pretty close. So we probably are going to wait and do this at the end of the year, but this gives us our amount of underapplied overhead for the month of June.